Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus Podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For the 8th season finale, my interview guest has taught English as a second language in the United States and China, is a former literary studies instructor at the Citadel, and is the author of the middle grade books Not Just Pirates and The Sea, English, and Me. Her name is Dr. Emily Sherwood, and my interview with Dr. Sherwood, which focuses primarily on her book Not Just Pirates, will follow the teleportation sound. Dr. Emily Sherwood, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus Podcast.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
What is it like being a literary studies and teacher education instructor at the Citadel?
Well, I did that the year before last. I'm no longer doing that job, but it was a really fun experience for the most part. I mostly did general education classes with undergraduates, and I really liked that. The cadets, they were really, really fun, which I don't know if you would think of that middle school, military school being fun, but they were really fun. And then I also did graduate classes with teachers.
Feel free to tell our listeners more about yourself.
Okay, well, my name is Emily Sherwood, and I apologize that you hear my daughter in the background. I have a PhD in literacy studies. I earned that in 2019. For years and years, I was an English as a second language teacher in rural East Tennessee, and I traveled from school to school doing that job. I loved that job. I did that for 10 years, and then I went back to school and earned my PhD. After that, I actually worked in China for 3 years, and I was in China during COVID. So that was a very interesting experience. I actually have a rough draft of a book about my time in China during COVID. It was very, very interesting. And then I came back to the United States. I was instructor at the Citadel for a year. I worked in general education last year as a ESL middle school teacher, and now I am starting my own business, tutoring and working with students. And I also have a book out called Not Just Pirates, which is for struggling middle grades readers who, for whatever reason, struggle with English, especially ones that are learning English. And as you can probably hear, and I apologize, she just got up from a nap and timing couldn't be worse. I have a new daughter. Her name is Ellie, and she's the love of my life. I'm 42. I didn't know that I was going to have a baby this age, and she's been absolutely wonderful. So now I'm starting this business to just kind of spend more time with my family and have more flexibility as I work with being a mom.
Without spoiling too much of Not Just Pirates, which is your young middle school age graphic novel, so 6th grade plus or minus a grade or two, what is it about?
Okay, so it's an adventure story. Not Just Pirates, it's an adventure story. It's about two boys, Manuel and Jaden, and it's Manuel's birthday. So for his birthday, they go to the beach in South Carolina, and they end up searching for treasure. And along the way, they have a huge adventure involving, quicksand and mud and treasure hunting and snakes, just all kinds of adventures, rats. And I'm not going to give the ending away, but it's a treasure story. It's about a treasure hunt. So it's mostly designed for boys, particularly boys who may be reluctant readers, who may find reading to be boring and really hard. It is a graphic novel, which means that it has illustrations. A lot of people call it the comic book format. It has illustrations and then, words under the illustrations.
Your book, as you and I have both mentioned, is advertised as a book designed to help young middle school age children improve their English skills. How does your book improve English skills with children in the target age group? So that would correspond, as I mentioned, about 6th grade in the American grade system, plus or minus a grade or two.
Right. So I use my expertise as an ESL teacher when I designed this book. So first of all, just the format of the book is very good at helping students to access text. Believe it or not, this is something that most people don't realize, and unfortunately, our school system doesn't recognize. Just reading a book helps to improve English. There was a really good study about that by Cho and Krashen, where these adults learning English just read books. They read the Sweet Valley Kids series, which was a very low level text. I think it's on a second grade reading level, which is about what this book is. It's about probably 1.5 to 2.0 level. So just reading an accessible text helps to read language, helps to improve your language skills and reading skills. Also, the comic book format, the graphic novel format. Of course, you got the picture cues that help you to match, to learn new vocabulary through that. And then we also have some features that help students. So we have in the book, there are several games and they're leveled. So some of the games are for people just learning English or maybe really struggling to read, and it goes all the way up to, maybe intermediate or high intermediate language and reading learning. We have that. We also have a dictionary, a glossary of all the nouns, the things that are in the book, which is very helpful for students. So it's really designed to motivate students and to help students read who maybe don't get to read a lot or don't enjoy reading.
Did you illustrate not just pirates? And if not, who was or were the illustrator or illustrators of your graphic novel? And what was it like to work with your illustrator or illustrators of your book?
I did not illustrate it. My first thought was to use Midjourney to do the pictures. However, Midjourney at this point, which is AI, by the way, it's an AI program where you say what illustration of they do it. They had absolutely beautiful illustrations, but the problem with AI right now is that it is not consistent. So, for example, I would type in something, and they even have a feature where you say use this character, and we use the same character, but she would look different. So, for example, the hotel clerk in one of the pictures, she was wearing a necklace, and one of them she wasn't. They might be wearing different colors. The background might be different. AI is not really at that point yet where it can do illustrations for books consistently, where you need, the same characters over and over and so forth. So I actually worked with High Value Author, which is an editor, and I paid them both to subcontract the pictures out and to help me to design and market the book. And they did a really good job. I think the pictures look really good.
How long did it take you to write Not Just Pirates?
It really didn't take me that long. I want to say I wrote the book in about 8 weeks, probably the draft. And then it took probably another, let's see, the book was written in about 8 weeks over last winter. Yeah, I would say that during fall and winter of last year. Then I kind of held on to it for a while, and I hired the editor in February, and the book came out in June. So all in all, the whole process was 6 to 7 months.
Is Not Just Pirates, is that book self-published, traditionally published, or hybrid published?
It's self-published. So not High Value Author is a group that works with specifically self-publishers. So they helped me to get it into, all the markets, Ingram Spark, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all of those.
How did your experience as a reading specialist in China shape your approach to literacy education as you're a literacy educator?
It was very interesting. The school that I was at is not a traditional Chinese school by any stretch of the imagination. It was a school for students who wanted to study in the United States or in other English-speaking countries. So it was an English immersion school. So in other words, students there were all learning English to some degree. And I kind of had an idea of what worked in East Tennessee, which was, having students read large amounts of text and a little bit of phonics, but not a lot, unless you notice the student needed it. There were several students who needed phonics. But, generally a lot of exposure to language, a lot of text, academic vocabulary. What I found in China was that many of the students learned just by memorization. So I had a lot of students who memorized words, but they never really caught on to the pattern of language, particularly how words work, how grammar works, and that sort of thing. So I actually developed a reading intervention program that was based on phonics. And as far as I know, it's the first one ever been done with a population like that. And it was pretty successful. The students that were in it, most of them greatly increased their reading levels in just a very short time. Within a semester, most 1 hour a week, and in a semester, most of them went up 2 or 3 reading levels. So that was really interesting because I did not realize that, particularly as populations like that who maybe have a different alphabet, very different sound system, that was a need for secondary students. So actually, the program that I'm developing now is for students like that who maybe have pretty good English vocabulary, spoken vocabularies, but just never learned the pattern of English, any kind of phonics or that sort of thing, and that may be making them struggle in school or in work.
I'm going to ask a question about literacy education. I don't know if exactly you're familiar with the subject, but I watched a video on YouTube as part of the PBS Storied YouTube channel, where they sometimes have a linguistics segment called Other Words. And Dr. Erica Brzezinski, who's a linguist at the University of Texas, Austin, if I recall correctly, was doing the video presentation. She did this whole video about what's known as cueing, in which students in elementary school are not taught phonics. They're taught to read based on like the first letter and the length of the word, and not really taught to read out the word fully. Is cueing, in your opinion, a bad approach to teaching reading?
So the school that I went to, who I worked with some of the top people in the country, I was very, very fortunate to work with them. And it was based on balanced reading. So what balanced reading means, and there's a lot of misconceptions about what it means. People think it means no phonics, and that's bad. And that is bad because phonics is very helpful to children. They do need to learn phonics, particularly at the lower grades. It's helpful. However, students also need to learn strategies, and cueing is a strategy. If you don't know a word and you have a picture there maybe of the word, cueing can help you to learn that word and to put it into your vocabulary. Phonics does not solve everything. Only about 60% of words could be read, 60 to 70% of words could be read by phonics. So yes, students do need to learn phonics, but strategies like cueing can also be helpful.
What is your best advice for educators and parents for helping struggling readers and trying to help them succeed?
There are a few things. I think the first thing is to really get at the root of the problem. Unfortunately, in education, particularly in large school systems, particularly with the advent of programs like MTSS and RTI, there is this belief that you have to have a program that works, the program for every student, that every student needs the same thing. For example, you hear a lot of Arthur Gillingham, which is a program for students who have been diagnosed with dyslexia. That is phonics based. So that might really be helpful for students who struggle with phonics. However, there are students who have comprehension issues. Doing more phonics is not going to help them at all. In fact, it'll probably just make them hate reading more. So I think it's really important that we have accurate assessments, and we also have plans for each student that really is tailored to their needs. That's the first thing. The second thing is students really need to read more. Unfortunately, in this day and age, when we have YouTube and we have TV shows and video games, reading has kind of gone out the window, and we're seeing that that's becoming a problem. A student needs to read on average at least 2 hours a school day, just reading. And of course, schools are not doing that. There's too many demands with testing and with other things. And instead of that, schools are doing, reading just short amounts of text at a time, or they're, focusing explicitly on directed instruction, which again has its place. Directed instruction definitely has its place, particularly at the lower grades. But we really need to get students reading more. And that's something I think schools and parents have largely overlooked. A lot of parents just don't even realize that that's something they could do that can significantly help their child without spending, thousands of dollars on programs necessarily. Just reading can help a lot.
What advice would you give to teachers working with students from many different and diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds?
I think this also goes back to that students have individual needs. I think there's a tendency in this country to lump students who struggle are students who are learning English into one box. For example, people think that students learning English in ESL programs are all Spanish. They're not. They're not all Spanish speaking. And a child that I taught last year in India had very different needs from my child who was a migrant worker from Latin America. So I think it's very important to really get to what the student needs. And that goes back to really knowing your students. And we have reading inventories and things that can be helpful, running records where the student reads. That can really be helpful. But each student needs something different, and a canned curriculum or even a set of textbooks is not going to reach every student.
What are some of the biggest challenges facing literary educators today? And this kind of ties into the previous question, but not fully.
There are lots of challenges in general with education today, and literacy, particularly in Tennessee in the early 2000s. There was a big push for literacy, and we actually made really good progress as a state. Tennessee did. Now there are so many concerns in education, particularly with things like students who have socio-emotional needs and, teacher shortages and, political things. There are lots of things. For example, school boards are having to spend a lot of time talking about book banning, which is not something that's conducive to literacy learning. If you ban all the books, that gives the impression that literacy isn't good and that's scary. So that's part of it, or kind of the societal and school problems. Also truancy. The school I taught at last year had 40% of students who were chronically not at school. So there's those problems, which are just kind of the state of education in general. And then when it comes to literacy, students don't read a lot. A lot of students are lacking basic skills, and people blame everything on COVID. But that was in part because of COVID. But also, even before COVID, we were facing a literacy crisis because literacy is something that is so foundational, and many times students just don't learn what they need to learn in the lower grades. And there is a lot of political stuff about that. For example, the idea that you have to use canned programs for every child, which is not good, or the idea that you can only use structured programs. So we just have a lot of challenges. The rest of the world is going up in education pretty drastically. Asia, Latin America, Africa are all improving, and the U.S. is falling behind. But again, there's lots of sociocultural reasons for that and political reasons.
One final question. What is your favorite part about living in the South Carolina Low Country?
The weather. I don't hesitate with that. The weather is usually really nice all year round. It doesn't get too hot. It does get hot in the summer, but compared to South China, it doesn't feel super hot, and the winters are extremely pleasant. That has to be my favorite thing. I miss Tennessee a lot, if you want me to be honest. I really loved living there, but I do enjoy the weather here. The culture here is also pretty good for the most part. People are very kind, but they're not judgmental. It's a very laid-back culture.
Dr. Sherwood, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus Podcast. You were an amazing guest for my season finale episode.
Your season finale, I'm honored. Thank you so much.
Dr. Sherwood was an amazing guest to interview. With this being the season finale, I want to acknowledge that season 8 of the podcast has been the most difficult season for me personally. Especially over the past couple of months, I've not been feeling well both physically and mentally for a variety of reasons and due to multiple causes. I hope I begin feeling better soon because season 9 of the podcast begins next week. Before I sign off, I want to briefly talk about the recent Los Angeles area wildfires and how they've impacted a guest I interviewed earlier this season. Earlier in season 8, I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Laura Gabayan, who is the author of the nonfiction book Common Wisdom. Laura, like many in the Los Angeles area, lost her home to the wildfires, but fortunately, she and her family are alive, safe, and well. I hope season 9 of the podcast is better for me, my guests, and you, the listener, than season 8 was. For one final time this season, this is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. I'll be back next week. Copyright Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.